But the scene actually has some built-in hinges already. If we forget about the woman for a moment, both the internal two-shot on the men and each of the close-ups are already in a master relationship to the second line. So if we're coming from external dialogue and we want to go to the far camera, the two-shot could be just as useful a hinge. An issue here, though, is that in this shot, the line we're coming from is still fresh in our memory, and we'd need to wait a little as we get used to the new line before cutting to the far camera. So using the near reverse to hinge is still the better solution. With the A shape a little wider, we're likely to want to do dialogue between the central character and each of the other characters. The simplest way to get them covered is to place 3 internal cameras outward from the center, which will allow us to cut the scene in any order. But doing external reverse pairs is a little trickier. We'll first put in a pair for the red man and the woman. We're placing the pair on this side of their line so the internal cameras can work as close-ups, but also because it keeps us inside the action. If we put the cameras out here, we'd separate the two characters and the dialogue would be more private. Out here, we wouldn't be able to use the internal cameras. Let's place another reverse for the two men, also inside the action. The easiest way to connect all the cameras in the scene is to use the red man's close-up as a hinge. From here, we can get to all the other cameras. We get easily into the external shot on the woman, the reverse on the red man, and back into the close-up. We get easily into the external shot on the blue man, the reverse on the red man, and back into the close-up. Since these two cameras are on the same side of both lines, we can also go directly between them. Cutting between them, the red man switches sides in the frame, but since we understand it as two overlapping groups, it makes sense. Going between the two other external reverses naturally won't work. Starting in the first one, the jump across two lines is very distracting. But let's go ahead and look at what happens if we place one of the reverse pairs outside the dialogue. Here we have almost no way to get into these reverses, so this camera is the only choice for a hinge. From the hinge, let's look at the two only cutting options, starting with this one. We'll then be pivoting on the red man to the similar reverse on the woman. He stays in the same part of the frame, and the two other characters simply replace each other. This can get jumpy if the shots don't look different enough, so let's bring in some background. Pivoting back, the cut makes more sense, but can still be a little on the edge because the shots are so similar. Hinging to the other reverse is a smoother cut, but causes us to leap around more, which can sometimes be startling as well. As we go from one reverse to one on a different line, we're still pivoting on the man. There's no preference here because both work, and it's a choice we can make in editing. Our only concern when shooting is to make sure to build in a hinge. If we want some master coverage of the A shape, a thing that works great is to place one line straight down the center and position the master on it, and also a mirror on the other side. Cutting back and forth, both cameras are exactly centered, and each shot is a mirror of the other, which can be interesting coverage by itself. But the beauty is that just as with a close-up on the man, we can get to and from any camera in the scene from these masters. The L shape is a variation of the A shape where two characters are lumped together and one is further away. Given everything we've already looked at, this should be extremely easy to cover. With the main conversation being between the women, we'll put in two reverses. They're on this side of the line to be nearer any conversation with the man. This camera will probably be our hinge, so we'll put in an internal shot on the man on this side of the line. Let's also create an internal two-shot on the women to mirror. When the conversation turns to the man, if the red woman is mainly doing the talking, we'll put in a close-up on her to mirror his close-up directly. If this is a short scene, we've already overcovered it, but let's top it off with an external reverse here and an external reverse here. So starting in the external reverses between the women, we're cutting back and forth since this is the main dialogue. Out in the hinge, we suddenly cut to the close-up on the man as he makes a comment. In the two-shot on the women, they turn to him. Here we do a bit of external reverse dialogue between the two groups. At some point, the conversation becomes more personal between the man and the red woman, so we cut between his close-up again and her close-up. Back in this external reverse, the women stand for a bit, then again turn to each other. We cut back into the hinge. and then the reverse on that line. Back in the hinge, we cut to the man's close-up again for a silent reaction. With the L shape, let's introduce a unique way of cutting across the line. Since the L shape closely resembles the A shape, the main difference is that the dialogue centers around two characters with a third occasionally participating, in this case the blue man. With two internal reverses on the red man and woman, we'll put a third camera for the blue man out here, still on our side of the line, and a close-up on him as well. Obviously, we'll be able to cut between these three cameras, bringing in the blue man with this camera. Using that as a hinge, we can cut to the close-up, back into the hinge, and out to the reverse dialogue. That's doing it by the book, but the unique thing about this setup is that we don't need the hinge. Starting a reverse dialogue between the red man and woman, we'll be skipping the hinge and cutting straight to the close-up on the blue man. As we cut, it makes just as much sense as it would have using a hinge, even though we're jumping the line. Cutting back into reverse dialogue, the blue man was looking at the red man, so we'll cut back to him. The reason it works is that in the close-up, we really don't know how far back we are. We could produce almost the exact same shot by being back here with a longer focal length. So even though we're jumping the main line, we don't necessarily know it. This is useful because it allows us to do close-ups on all the characters on the other side of the line. Here we're again cutting back and forth in reverse dialogue between the red man and woman, but the close-up will be on the blue woman deeper into the scene. We cut to her for a comment, but the close-up is likely to be perceived as being on our side of the line. Even if it isn't, it's close to being legal, and if we've previously established geography with a master, we'll get away with it. This technique doesn't look pretty on paper, but it works and is invaluable when we're dealing with a lot of characters. In this chapter, we'll look at the U, I, and O shapes, which are very similar and can be handled using identical techniques. The U shape has two rows of any number of characters and one center character to complete the U. If we remove the center character, we're left with two I shapes across from each other. If we bring him back and add a character at the other end of the table, we have a full circle or O shape. The main difficulty here is that we're dealing with a lot of characters, and with dialogue crisscrossing the scene, we need a way to manage what is easily a very complex scene. A thing to notice is that it's generally easier to cover the scene from inside and outwards. If these three characters are having dialogue, this creates three lines, and staying within them we can cut back and forth as we please. As soon as we move outside and do over the shoulders, we'll be crossing lines in every cut, and we'll have to work out a plan for hinging. A second thing to notice is that with a master of the scene, getting coverage and managing lines becomes much more forgiving because the geography is fresh in our minds. And if we later find ourselves entangled in lines or have lost orientation, there's no faster way to get out than with a master, even if it means crossing a line on the way out. A third thing to notice is that doing groupings that include more than one character is much better than doing single shots on each character. Not just because we have less cameras to shoot, but because overlapping characters and scenery make spatial continuity easier to maintain. This means that even if the red man is mainly doing the talking, we frame the shot to include the extra next to him, and this will also be her shot if she has dialogue. A last thing to notice is that the dialogue is usually between very few characters and the rest function as extras. So if we remove the others, we can easily cover the scene using techniques we've already looked at. Here the dialogue centers around the man in the suit and the blue woman, with occasional comments from the others, so let's try the line crossing L shape we looked at in the last chapter. We'll simply put in two reverses for them, a master, an insert on the blue man and the red woman, and an insert on the red man and the surrounding extras. Starting in the master, we'll cut to one reverse on the main dialogue, and the other. Then sneak across the line to this shot, and to this shot, back in reverse dialogue, and so on. Finding a shape based on the characters that really matter quickly gives structure to the coverage, and adding all other cameras according to these lines gives us more than enough to cover most scenes with. But let's look at a different technique that can handle any scene regardless of how complex it is. When the dialogue is all over the place, and no simple technique will solve it, the trick is to draw every conceivable line in the scene and then place cameras that work for as many lines as possible. This will temporarily make the diagram look overwhelming. The obvious lines come from dialogue. Here the CEO at the end of the table talks with a blue woman. He also talks with a red man, and with the red woman, who also talk with each other. At some point, the blue woman comments on something the red woman is saying. And at some point, the blue man comments on something the red man is saying, after which the CEO adds a remark. Other lines come from reactions, or from anywhere there's a tension between characters. This extra will have a reaction to something the red man says, which creates a line here. And this extra will have a reaction to something the red woman says. For the beginning of the scene where this line is active, we'll start with a wide over the shoulder on the woman, a close-up on her, and a close-up on the CEO, which we've placed like this so it'll work for dialogue with the other characters as well. For the main dialogue between the CEO and the red man and woman, which happens within this triangle, we'll add 2 more outward cameras, and all 3 will cut smoothly as long as we're inside the triangle. For the dialogue between the red man and woman, we'll also add a pair of external reverses, which we'll need to hinge in and out of because we'll be crossing these lines. For the remaining cameras, let's try to be a little wider to build an overview of the scene. While the red man is having dialogue with the red woman, the blue man makes a comment, so that camera will need to be between these 2 active lines. We'll put it far enough back to capture the CEO's comments, which follow immediately after. Again, back in the dialogue between the red man and woman, the blue woman makes a comment, and with these 2 active lines, the camera will need to be somewhere in this area. We'll again make it wide enough to also get some facial reaction from this extra, which would otherwise have been a separate shot. Finally, this extra makes a few grimaces during the conversation. And since we're coming from the red man's dialogue, we'll put a camera here on our side of both lines. If we now take out the lines, every camera is carefully placed to be as useful as possible. This staging layout is completely tailor-made to the scene, and if the dialogue were different, we'd have to reblock it. After we've cut dialogue between the CEO and the blue woman, the CEO talks to the red man, after which he talks to the red woman. The red man makes a sudden comment, and the woman turns her attention. After this, we cut between the external reverses, which shows their seating arrangements a little clearer. Now we want to get back to the CEO as he listens to their conversation, but we need to get back inside the main triangle first. The CEO listens. And over on the woman. Now the blue woman makes a comment. The red man says something to the red woman. Now the blue man injects a comment. The red man turns to him and responds. The extra in the shot from before sends a secret signal to the blue man. The red man makes another comment. The extra at the end of the table frowns. From here, the red woman makes another comment. The CEO turns to the blue woman. And on it goes. The technique of drawing all lines in the scene and picking cameras that fit with as many lines as possible allows us to cover scenes with even an absurd number of lines. The U shape is a very typical shape, but the way we covered it had more to do with the fact that we had a lot of characters. This is why if we take out the CEO and are left with the double I shape, another typical shape, the method is the same. Or if we occupy both ends of the table in an O shape. When the characters are very close together, we have no choice but to cover them from outside the action. What we'll look at here applies equally well to any shape, but will work with the O shape because it's completely enclosed. If we removed one character, it would be a U shape, and we would have a much easier time getting inside the dialogue, maybe start